And so if we can prepare our children at young ages, now, is it 100% guarantee that they're going to believe and follow the truth all the days of their lives? No, it's not. There is no such guarantee as that. But we're at least giving them the skills that they need to not just be swept up by, somebody who's charismatic with a microphone.
Welcome, everyone, to Reclamation, a beEmboldened initiative. I'm Naomi, the founder and executive director here at BE. We exist for those impacted by spiritual abuse by providing support for the prevention of victimization as well as revictimization. We desire to create a safe place to ask the hard questions, to heal, and to rebuild. And today, I have a returning guest for you. For anyone who listened to mine and Elizabeth's first conversation, I am excited to welcome her back. This is Elizabeth Urbanowicz. She is a follower of Jesus who is passionate about equipping kiddos to understand the truth of the Christian worldview. She works full-time on developing comparative worldview and apologetic resources for children, so for our young ones. Her goal is to prepare the next generation to be lifelong critical thinkers, which I love so much, and most importantly, lifelong disciples of Jesus. And today we're here to talk about Elizabeth's first book, which is so exciting, and it's entitled, What is Truth? And I will hold it up in a minute, but I want to mention first, Elizabeth, there are several things that I love about this book. And so for y'all who are listening and watching, I'm going to rattle some of those off, and then of course, I'll hand it over to Elizabeth. We'll ask some questions. But first, I love the simplicity and the relatability with which it was written, number one. Two, the engaging format that you are known for still came through even in this written version. And I don't think that's an easy task. So that was quite an accomplishment. I was very, very pleased to see, I could hear you in my head, as we were reading it and going through the book, which was really fun. And my son loved that. So the illustrations are absolutely adorable. Miranda Duncan, who is the illustrator, did a wonderful job. And I love the prioritization of teaching young minds how to think, not only what to think. I don't meet many people, honestly, potentially, if any, within the context that beEmboldened serves, so within the context of spiritual abuse, who were taught how to think well. They're more often told, this is what you need to think and believe. They don't necessarily know why. So they're not taught how to assess, how to contemplate something, how to logically and rationally assess information. So instead, again, they're told just to believe this. And in truth, oftentimes in ways they were being lied to. And so I love this as prevention for our kiddos who are then going to grow up and have to make their own choices for their communities. So with all of that being said, your book begins with this important education in a way that is accessible from early on, so from a young age. For those of us who desire to teach our children these skills, how does your new book do that?
Yeah, well, I think you did a great job of just summarizing some of the things that we're really hoping to do, because I know that the majority of your listeners, have been affected either personally by some kind of spiritual abuse, or those they love have been affected by that. And, you hit on two key areas there, that the Christian worldview is very clear that humans bear the image of God. And therefore each of us has inherent dignity, value, and worth. And as image bearers, we have been given the ability to think, and our mind is to be used for the glory of God. And so with those two things, we tried to hold those two things in tandem while writing this book. And you mentioned how we really try to get little ones engaged. It's not just sit down and listen. It's okay, sit down, and we're actually going to have your bodies involved, and we're going to have your mind involved, because you are important and you are valuable. And we want this book to help you grow in your ability to think. So we wanted to make this an interactive book. So yes, it's a book that you're going to want your little ones to sit on the sofa next to you while you're reading, but it also has them engaged. They're going to have to open their arms and say the word true, or cross their arms and say the word not true. And so we really wanted to engage them as God has created them, as these valuable little image bearers. And then, as you mentioned too, the second goal of the book is that we're going to be creating a paradigm in their mind, so that anytime they hear something, whether that be while they're on an iPad, or out on the playground or in a classroom, wherever they are, they're always asking themselves the question, what I just heard, is that true? Or is it not true? So we engage them in a really fun game in the book, but the goal is even, broader than the game, broader than the pages of the book, that we want to create this mental paradigm so that anytime they encounter any idea, they can ask themselves, is this true? or is this not true? And as you said, there are so many dangers when we're not equipped to ask ourselves, is what I just heard true or is it not true? Because especially as we're thinking, of cases of spiritual abuse or any type of abuse, the person who is the abuser, who has that power over us, usually that person is saying things that are not true, but that sound true. And then that can be really used to manipulate our emotions, can be used to manipulate our thoughts, can be used to manipulate our actions. And so we want to prepare our children, even from the youngest of ages, to be thinking anytime they hear something, is what I just heard true? Or is it not true? So that's really the twofold goal of this book, to really engage little ones as these valuable image bearers of the Holy God and to equip them with the skills they need to evaluate whether something is true or not true.
Oh, so beautifully said and so important. I want to give an example of what this looked like. This just happened the other day with my son. Of It kind of highlighted for me, like, oh, this is what his tendency is going to be. Here's why this true versus not true is going to be so important. So he believes in creation, of course, because that's what we're sharing with him. And we have shared a bit about how there is a belief in evolution, kind of giving him like, this is what some people believe. This is what we believe and why. And, we've done some basics on some of that. He's pretty inquisitive. And we were watching a pretty like educational show together. That's really fun. I won't mention it just because I'm about to say something that was kind of bad, but otherwise it's good. But we were watching, it's about animals and stuff. So all the critters, and they said something that was in alignment with evolution. I can't remember the exact comment, but they said something in alignment with evolution. And so then he turned to me and said, "Oh, mama, so God must have just made the ocean and then all the animals made themselves from one another," something like that. So basically what he did in his mind was he took what he already has believed, knows to be true, and then just assumed that this speaker was also speaking truth, and then figured out how to make it fit together to make it all be true. And in reality, it's okay. Well, is what he just said actually true though? Like, let's take a step back.
Yep. Yeah, and it's so good. I just in that situation, Naomi, like you've highlighted so many important things as we think about raising our kids. That one, you've already had some conversations with your son, about what is true. Then while he's engaged in this media, you're there engaged with him. You've developed a relationship with him where he's very comfortable just sharing what he's thinking with you. So then you get this peek inside his mind, like, oh, this is what's going on. And then you have the opportunity to have the conversation like, hey, buddy, let's think about this for a minute. Like, what does the Bible actually tell us about creation? And actually reading through Genesis 1, does it say that just like, pop, the animals popped out into existence? Like, no, that's not actually what it says, so like, let's think about this. So I love that example because you're highlighting so many important things that we need to do with our children in order to guide them to be critical thinkers.
Well, thank you. And I hope that that example is helpful again to all of you who are watching and listening to this later and knowing, oh, this could be kind of what's happening again in their minds. And so teaching this foundation of true versus untrue to even think in these terms, again, that's something that many of us were not taught at a young age, and it's going to serve us really, really well. Why did you actually, we may have touched on this already, but to ask you more directly, why did you choose What is Truth as your first book? Why was this your starting point?
Yes. Well, for our first curriculum that we have for little ones, Foundation Worldview, we're primarily a company that creates curriculum. And for our first curriculum, which is our biblical worldview curriculum, we start off with this concept of what is truth. And so as we thought through books to write, we were like, this has been the most helpful foundation. We've gotten so much feedback from people that this has been such an excellent starting point. So that's why we decided to start there with the book. And now I frequently get asked this question, whether it's about the book or the curriculum, like, why do you start off with truth? Like, why don't you start off with God? And absolutely, we need to teach our children about God. And that is so foundational. But the reason that we've chosen to start off with the concept of truth is because right now, the cultural tide that we're just swimming in teaches us and teaches our children that, truth is going to change from person to person. Truth is based on our emotions. Now, sometimes our emotions do point us towards the truth. Our emotions are always a good check engine light, like, why am I feeling this way? But our emotions do not always point us to the truth. Sometimes we can be deceived by our emotions. And, truth doesn't change from person to person. It's outside of us, it's objective. And so if we don't start off with that foundation, when we start teaching our children about God, what they're naturally going to hear is, oh, for my mom or for my dad or for my grandma, whoever is teaching this to them, this is what their truth is. That's nice. And then, what is true for someone else, where we want to start off with this foundation of truth so that our children understand that, we don't get to decide what is true and what is not true. What we have to do is we have the responsibility of seeking it out. Of anytime we hear something, asking ourselves, is that true or is that not true? And how do I know? So then when we present them with who God is, when we present them with scripture, they already have a foundation for understanding, okay, so what my mom is saying about God, either it's true or it's not true. It's not true because my mom believes it and not true because my next door neighbor doesn't believe it. It's either true or it's not true, and it's not dependent on my feelings. So that's why we're so passionate at Foundation Worldview about starting off with this foundation for truth, because really anything else we teach our children needs to be built on this foundation.
And Elizabeth, may I ask, this is going to be a bit more personal, but I'm wondering, for anyone who is unfamiliar with you and with the work that you've been doing, how did this come to be for you? Like for you yourself personally, how did you come to value this format of teaching and learning? Because again, it's not necessarily what we see. I was very thankful to have some of that in the school that I attended when I was younger, but it was actually a pilot program that they were doing. And I was just very blessed to be in it. And it helped me with these sorts of skills, helped me more now. I was still raised in a cult. So, it only did so much for me at the time, but I reflect back on that. And the way I think it helped my brain develop really served me later in coming out and making different choices for myself and in really looking for what is actually true and seeking that out. And I give a lot of that credit, of course, ultimately to the Lord. I don't want to say of course, because maybe that wouldn't be of course for someone, but for me, absolutely. But I see that opportunity to be a part of that program at a young age when our brains are being developed. Like they're still growing, they're still being formed. Our wiring is still getting put in there. And I think it was so formational and so helpful. And so I'm curious, like, how did you even come to see it from this perspective?
Yeah, well, hopefully this will be encouraging to your listeners, because I'm sure that most people are listening because they have already walked through a season of spiritual abuse, and even your story with starting this ministry, and the podcast that we're listening to is because of what God allowed you to walk through, as a child, and the wounds and the pain there. And now, God has redeemed that, and is using you to help others who have been in similar situations. And oddly enough, it's somewhat similar for me in why I'm passionate about teaching kids in this way, in that in my growing up years, I hated school. Like I hated it with a passion. And even just as I think back on my teachers, I didn't have very many teachers who were very nurturing or loving. And specifically, I can say this because this teacher is no longer alive. Otherwise, I wouldn't want to speak negatively about her. But in first grade, I just had a teacher who, now looking back at the time, like when I was in first grade, when I was 6, all I knew was that when I would get ready for school every morning, I would throw up because I was so nervous. I didn't have, like the skills to be able to articulate, why I was throwing up, why I was so nervous. But it was a teacher that she was just very verbally abusive to us as a class, like if you got it, and I mean, it wasn't like to the extreme or anything, but when you got an answer wrong, in front of the whole class, she'd be like, "What is wrong with you? You're so retarded. I can't believe, like just things like that." Or like, I just got a lot of like urinary tract infections when I was growing up. And so like my mom would always send me to school with a water bottle. So I'd have to use the bathroom frequently. And like every time I'd raise my hand to use the bathroom, she'd be like, "I'm going to bring in diapers for you tomorrow." Just like things like that, that like as like a 6-year-old, you can't really articulate like why you're feeling upset or why you're feeling nervous, but it was just terrible. But I remember sitting in my first grade classroom thinking, I don't ever want anybody else to have to feel this way. Like, this is just a terrible feeling. And I just thought, like when I grew up, I'd really like to like be the person standing up there, so that I can make sure that nobody ever has to feel this way. And fortunately, that is the way that God has gifted me, just more naturally as a teacher. And so as I grew and as, like I went to college and then had a classroom of my own, always that experience was in the back of my mind. I thought, what, I want to really figure out, how is God designed children to learn, and what can I do to meet that need? Now, did I do it perfectly all the time? No. I'm a sinner just like everyone else. And there was times when I had to, ask my students for forgiveness, when I wasn't as patient with them as I should have been, or, when I raised my voice, things like that. But that's what really got me passionate about seeking out, how can I engage little children in a way that aligns with God's design for them. And so just during my time in the classroom, I would just, take classes and read books and just, try things out on my students and just figure out like, okay, this is how God designed their mind to learn. If they can like hear something over and over and over again, if they can get their bodies involved, if they can like just know that the person who's in front of them like loves them and cares about them and like wants to be with them. These are all things that are going to equip them to learn in this way. So now through a book, they're not actually hearing from me, even though they're hearing my words. But with the way that we've designed a book, it has to be read to them, Lord willing, by someone who loves them. And so that while they're being read this, they're being engaged, but they also know that the person who's reading it to them loves them and they feel safe and they feel valued. And that's even, when we film our curriculum videos, I think the first two curriculums we filmed, our film crew used like a side angle, like they use, the typical front angle. And then also, like the panoramic, like side angle that's like typical when you're filming. And for our third curriculum, I said, you know what, guys, I know this is like not traditional. It's like not what you're supposed to do when filming. I was like, but I just want the front angle because the eye contact is so important. Like I can't reach out and I can't give these kids a hug. I can't ask them about their day. But if they can see my eyes the whole time and know that like this person who's teaching me really cares about me and like really values me and really wants me to know this, like that's exactly what we need. So so kind of like a long meandering story, but basically, just some situations that the Lord allowed me to go through and then how he's used that in my life and hopefully now to impact the lives of other people.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And I noticed, I think you just wrapped up another recording because I think I saw on Instagram, a little reel or so. It was recent anyway. I think you wrapped something up. And I actually took note that you were standing in the recording and that stuck out to me because that is helpful for our younger kiddos who have the energy and they want to be up and they want to be moving. It's impacting them in a different way. I think it brings them in. And I've seen even with my own, and people who listen to Reclamation regularly know I don't talk about my son all the time. It just seems appropriate for this episode. So please forgive me to use him as an example. But he feels like you and he have a relationship. And that's so helpful because you're greeting him in a way that he can receive and that is engaging for him. And that is very different than some teacher experiences he has had that I won't get into in further detail, but it can be tough, depending on the person's personality. And some of it's just, their natural bent. And some of it is, maybe they're ready to retire or they should, and it's time for them to move on with their life. And so we've run into some of that. And so it's something that it's a relationship, to kind of put that in quotes, but I think it's intended to feel relational, even though it's through a screen, that I think parents can feel really good about. And I think it even models for me as a parent, different ways to engage him. So I would offer to parents, it can be helpful to sit, not only is it good for us to know what our children are listening to, but even when it's someone where we found we really trust them, like I trust Elizabeth to be speaking to my child across the screen. That isn't something that I feel stressed out about. Even though I have that trust, it's great for me to sit down and engage with him too. It's a good opportunity for us to be able to have more of a conversation, and it helps guide me in how to do that with him. So it helps me feel more equipped. So again, as an example, based on this book, What is Truth, which I am going to pull it up because I want you guys, I'm going to cover my face for a second. Like these two little guys are so cute and fluffy. And I'm a texture person, and so is my son. We have a very fluffy cat, and so we just like how fluffy and soft that they look. But last night we were reading this to my son again, because he gets on his kick, with books, and he wants to read them over and over again. So this is the current book that he's on a kick with. And he noted that you did not trip him up, Miss Elizabeth. You didn't trick him. He got them all right. And so he wanted us then to ask him more and to see and to try to make it tricky. And so it kept it going in a really fun, engaging way for the three of us as a family. And we almost got him when we asked, I think my husband said, God split the blue sea so Moses and the Israelites could walk through. And we almost got him. He was like, he's like, true. And then he went, no, it was red. And so he did get it.
I love it.
And so it inspires more of that family engagement time. And like I said, equips us parents at the end of a day where if you've both worked or even if you haven't, you're just tired and you're like, okay, how do I approach this? It gives us tools and it gives us a starter. And that's something that I really, really value. I really value as an adult. I'm like, this is a tool for me as well as a parent. It's not only fun for my kid, it helps guide me in conversation and helps me explain some stuff that can be hard to explain. How do I explain true versus untrue to my child? I'm not really totally sure. And so all of Foundation Worldview's resources help with this. So anything that you would add?
Thank you for sharing that, because that's exactly what we're wanting to do. And even just the story, of your son being like, oh, hey, give me more, wanting more. That's exactly what we want. Because again, we want to create these mental categories of true and not true. And as you just described, it's in a situation where it's fun and it feels like a game and it feels like something you want to do more of. And so that way, truth is something that has, like a positive emotion attached to it and positive memories attached to it. Because a lot of times, the only time we talk about truth is when our children are in trouble and we're like, okay, now tell me the truth about this, what happened? Or if they hear something that's not true, obviously we want to address that and we want to talk through that with them. But if we've already spent, several, hours over the course of like a month or so, training them on what's true and what's not true, it's not going to feel like, oh my goodness, what's going on? This bad thing that I just heard. It's like, oh yeah, this is just part of my everyday responsibility that I have to think through. Is this true or is this not true? And so I think it can really help us as we're engaging with our children when we've already created those two mental categories. We've had fun playing with it as a game. And then when a more serious situation, or even if it's not so serious, comes up, it doesn't have to feel so grave and heavy. It's like, oh, we've already practiced this. Let's talk about this. Is this something that's true or is this not true? And how do we know? So thank you for sharing that, because that's exactly what we're hoping is happening in families.
Yes, it's absolutely working. It's fun. Yeah, it made it fun. And so we really have a good time with it too. And for any parents out there where maybe you're not parents yet, and that may be in your future, or you've got younger ones who aren't really asking all the questions yet, y'all, they're coming. And there's some doozies where I felt pretty prepared, honestly, for the questions, like going into being a mom, just with different educational background and, kind of the area that I work in and the variety of ages that I can come across. I feel like I'm going to be okay. Not, totally confident, definitely not cocky, but just like, okay, I think I have a footing. And then some of the stuff he's asked is just, how do I break this down to a 4-year-old level or a 5-year-old level or now a 6-year-old level? And that is really difficult to do and do it justice, especially if we're going to start talking about like the Trinity or something. I'm like, baby, we can't really explain that to an adult. So we're just going to go with it. So it can get really, really tough.
I love that.
How can you see the work that you're doing at Foundation Worldview, like through this book and through your continuously growing curriculum library as well, helping parents prevent their children from being deceived by those wolves in sheep's clothing once they're older? Again, we've kind of talked around this indirectly, but I want to directly camp out here for a minute. How do you see this as really setting our kiddos up when we start here and we continue to build on it?
Yeah, that's a really important question for us to think through, because I think a lot of times we wait until they're, adolescents or teens or young adults before we think about training them to be discerning. But when we do that, we've really lost so much ground, so much important time of relationship building, so much important time of, just the development of the mind, the development of the brain. So it's so important that we start young, like as we've already talked about, so that it's fun. It doesn't feel like something that's like super serious. It's something that can be enjoyable, but then that's going to be implemented in any and every situation. So, if we know that, that things are coming after our kids from every angle, there's temptations coming from without and also from within, because we have Adam's sin, because of the fall in Genesis 3. And so it's so important when our kids are little, again, to do this because, at that stage, where your son is right now, at the age of 6, the way that God has designed it is our children, usually up until around the age of 8, they just look at us with stars in their eyes. Do they still have bad attitudes and temper tantrums and things like that? Yes. But, no matter what we say, they view as true. We're starting around the age of 9. That's where they're starting to be like, well, why? Is that really true? And then, by the age of 12, they start to become a lot more socially aware and they care so much about what their peers think. What we think, tends more to fade into the background. And so while we have them in this stage where just very naturally they believe the things that we say, rather than just teaching them what to think, we want to equip them how to think. So then, in the older ages when they're starting to, just question some things that we say, which is natural. It's a healthy part of development, when they reach, 9, 10. And then by the time they're 12, where they're kind of like distancing themselves a little bit from their parents because they care more about what their peers think, they're going to already have this paradigm, these boxes, these mental categories in their mind. So even if emotionally they don't care quite as much, like what we think or what we believe is true, they already have these categories in mind to think, okay, what that person just told me, is that true or is that not true? And how do I know? And you mentioned, specifically wolves in sheep's clothing, which we know, we've been warned multiple times in scripture, that there are going to be wolves, who make their way into the flock. And so we want to make sure that we're training our kids with these skills, because usually why do people follow wolves? Because it's very emotionally appealing. Usually it's someone who's very charismatic, who's very winsome, who lots of people want to follow, but someone who's saying things that have like this kernel of truth with like a whole lot of lies that are just getting people tripped up emotionally and ensnaring them and manipulating them. And so if we can prepare our children at young ages, now, is it 100% guarantee that they're going to believe and follow the truth all the days of their lives? No, it's not. There is no such guarantee as that, but we're at least giving them the skills that they need to not just be swept up by, somebody who's charismatic with a microphone, or somebody who's charismatic, and has a really great handshake, or makes them feel good initially. So that's why it's so important that we start this training when they're young and they're still in that phase of like, they really care about what we think and they really care about what we say. And so we're teaching them how to think, not just what to think.
Mm-hmm. It's so powerful. And I truly believe like this is the world of difference that we can offer our children. Those of us who grew up in a different way, this is the start of how we make it look different for them. Because as you hear Elizabeth, she's talking about the how, and it's not just indoctrination. It's not this like, just tell them everything that they're supposed to believe. Now we know from an apologetic standpoint to bring that in here, it doesn't really work. Because inevitably, ultimately, at some point, those beliefs that we hold get pushed up against. We get some pushback in the world, and that's not a bad thing that it can get some pushback. But it can have really harmful, tough results when starting at a younger age, we haven't been equipped to know how to handle that. And we don't know how to actually think about it. And that's where we can see our kiddos, going off in their 20s, now young adults, and very quickly following whatever the loudest voice is, because that is the loudest voice and they don't know actually how to discern, like you're talking about, Elizabeth. It's so important. And I have seen that difference already through some other kiddos that I know, where I've seen them start younger and then we get to see them a few years in, or, up into those teenage years. And we see such a different ability that they have to think well. And I would encourage anyone who maybe is, thinking about this for the first time, just considering thinking well as being a high value, that's something that we want to really value highly. We want to really invest in, for our children as well as for ourselves. Because of course, for many of you as adults who would be listening to this or watching this, this can be new for you too. you're kind of figuring out, well, what is true? Is truth real? Does truth exist? And then, what is true and what is untrue? And how do I think about that? And how do I know? And very important questions that, we talk about here at BE, and I think intersect really well with what Elizabeth and her team are striving to do starting at a young age, so that when our kiddos reach our ages, this is just no brainer for them at that point. It's just wired in there, hardwired in there, and they are set up for success.
And, you mentioned in there, Naomi, about asking questions and like having our kids ask questions and, even getting pushback isn't bad. And I think, especially as we're thinking about wolves in sheep's clothing, if we train our kids to ask good questions, if somebody actually is seeking to guide us, in a healthy way, in a way that honors God, in a way that is seeking truth, they're not going to be threatened by questions. They're not going to be someone who is like, well, don't ask me that. They're going to be like, oh, that's a great question. Let's explore it, even if they don't agree with the fact that we're questioning it. Where if someone immediately is like, you don't ask questions, you just sit down and you be quiet and you listen to me, like that's something that we can prepare our kids for as well. That, like with the way that we handle their questions, like, oh, buddy, I am so glad you asked that. That is such a good question. Like God wants us to ask questions. God wants us to seek these things out. That will also prepare them as well, because, they'll see like, oh, if somebody truly is following God, if someone really is wanting what's best for me, they're going to welcome my questions. They're not just going to try to squelch them. So I think that's a really powerful thing that you brought up as well.
Oh, such a good point. And I think as parents, we can get a little bit nervous, maybe sometimes if we're like, oh, we don't know the answer. And so I would encourage all of us, it's okay to say that. Just like you said, you had to apologize to your students sometimes. It's such good modeling. So for us to model, you know what? I'm not going to make up an answer, and I'm not going to shut down the question. We're going to go figure it out. So let's go explore that and let's find out together.
Yes. Yes. And I love that because that's even more powerful than being like, well, let me tell you the answer, because then our kids are just going to think like, oh, I always go to mom because she's the expert. Well, once they don't, like want to ask mom as many questions, they're going to go to some other expert, where if mom or dad says, you know what, that's a great question. I don't know. Let's go research this together. Well, what are we doing right there? We're giving them the skills to investigate. We're training them in the skills to investigate and to seek out truth, rather than just being like, well, come to me. I am the fount of all wisdom and I can answer all of your questions. Because then they're just going to go to somebody else one day. So I love that you brought that up.
Oh, that is such a good point. Yeah, I hadn't really you're helping me like solidify some things, like cement some things. Yes, that's such a good point, because you're absolutely right. When you said like when they're hitting around that age of 12 and they're not so much wanting to hear what mom and dad have to say, then they're going to go back to that loudest voice idea, when start or whatever that looks like. And we can recognize certain tendencies, of course, in our children because we know them in a unique way. We also know what maybe they've inherited from us. And so we can recognize some of those maybe struggles that they're going to have. And I can already see in my son, we've been told so many times that he's so obviously a natural born leader. And yet, while the similar things have been said about my husband and myself, we also see the same tendency that we had, where there's a certain type of personality, though. It's just a certain type of personality where we will automatically go to the second. We will automatically become like that person second. And it's not necessarily a good thing. And we can see that with a kiddo in his class right now. Super sweet kid. Certain personality things where we can see like our son is just all about this kid. And well, this kid is a little bit more aloof emotionally. It's just his personality. And so my son then is wanting the approval of this one child. Yet everybody else in the class is like all about my child, like he's like the fun, friendly, like, he's the gatherer, get the personalities together. Let's play, let's be creative. And he's sort of that one. I'm a little concerned that hopefully he doesn't become a partier in the future, but he's just like that, like, let me round up the folks, which is so great. And I love that, very much encouraging, such a hugger, but there's this one personality. And so as we recognize things like that, we're able to start to teach and equip so that they don't find themselves in some of those positions we've found ourselves in. And I think he's learning a lot about true and untrue through this relationship, because there's certain things that are happening where we're having to back up and look at, well, is this true of a healthy relationship? And we're even getting to talk about some of those sorts of things. Doesn't mean this is an unhealthy child. It's a child, but like, hey, what kind of dynamic do we look for in like the people we're going to be closest to and the people we're going to, make these sort of, and so there's so much that can be done here that all falls into truth, and untruth. And I love how Elizabeth is taking it from this very like practical and tangible position. And I think that you can then apply it in these other ways, like with emotional development as well in relationships. I think there's so much that can be done here that can be built on. So Elizabeth, I wanted to ask you too, what age range would you recommend for this book?
So we say that it's really for kids around 4 to 8 years of age. Obviously, if somebody has multiple children, you can include kids a little bit younger than 4 in or kids a little bit older than 8 in. But if you just have an 11-year-old at home, this is not the book for you because it's going to be written below their level. So we say about 4 to 8 is the age range.
Yeah. And that seems perfect. Again, my son's right smack in the middle, and I think it's perfect for him. So I can see that personally. One other question, and then I have a question from my son that we also share. So you've probably been asked this by everyone too, but we'll land there. But do you have any thoughts on what would maybe be some good questions to like ask our children before, during, or after we're reading the book? Any kind of thoughts around? I know I gave an example of what naturally happened with my child, but any other suggestions for someone wanting to engage more around this?
Yeah. So, I mean, our number one recommendation is exactly what you did with your son, to just continue the game because this is something that we want, just to be like the paradigm that our kids always go to. But then we just recommend, beforehand, you could have a conversation and be like, what do you think of when I say the word truth? And most kids, are going to be like, I have to tell the truth. But, just so if you want to find out, an idea of what your child already thinks about the word truth, that's a great question to ask beforehand. And then afterwards, once you've read the book several times and, maybe played the game with it, more true and not true, then to be continually asking that question so that your child gets in the habit of asking that question. So when you're turning on a show, and watching a show and somebody says something, to say, is that true? And don't always ask it just when it's something that's not true. It can also be when it's something that's true, because we want our children to be used to, recognizing truths as well, so just so they're constantly asking themselves that question. Or when you read other books, like, what this character just said, is that true or is that not true? So that it just becomes a regular part of their thinking. So that would be my recommendation there.
Yes, I love that. That's such a good idea. We have a road trip coming up. And so I have some, ideas right now of what we can do as we're driving to just keep him engaged. And I love, again, how you get like hands moving and stuff. So it's just more interactive. It's so helpful with young children. I hope that you have heard this 1,000,001 times. And so I'll be the 1,000,002nd. I hope that you have. It is such a gift, the way that you engage young children. You are that person where it's just such a natural fit. And it doesn't mean that's all you have to offer the world by any means. I'm not trying to like pigeonhole you into a certain area. Like wherever you go, like wherever God is leading you. And yet this makes so much sense. Not everybody has it in the way that you have it. And it is such a gift and a blessing to families like mine to have someone like you spending all of your time, not all of your time. I know you have a personal life, but spending so much of your time creating resources like this to help us. It is truly a blessing. And we are so grateful. So again, I hope you've heard this 1,000,001 times and I'm the 1,000,002nd, but I just want to give you that encouragement today and give you that reminder. This is not something that we all can do the way that you can do. And so it is such a gift that you're coming alongside us in our homes and helping us do this for our kids.
Oh, well, thank you. I do appreciate that encouragement. And I'm so grateful for the many people that God has brought along on my team that, just fill all of these needed roles, because I have a certain skill set, but we would not be able to do what we do without so many different people's skill sets. And even someone was asking me the other day, they were like, Elizabeth, if you get married one day and have kids, like, would you just kind of like teach them this stuff on your own, or would you use your curriculums? And I'm like, oh my goodness, I would so use our curriculums. I was like, because so many different people have worked on it to craft it in a way that's much more skilled than if I were just sitting down, across the kitchen table with my own kids. So I'm so grateful. God gifts us all differently, and then he brings us together in Christ's body, so that we can make up the body, and the body wouldn't function without each of its parts. So I'm really grateful.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if you're like me, but it definitely when it comes to the tech stuff too, I'm like, please, please, somebody help me. I cannot handle this stuff. Yes, absolutely. So Elizabeth, final question, and Blaze was the first person to ask this, but Michael and I were also both wondering, do you have future plans to make this a series? And that comes with a please, of course. A please do.
Yes. So we actually already have the second book in the series. It's already been written and illustrated. I'm not sure yet when that's going to come out. So that just depends on a few other things with the business. So we do have the second book coming out, and we'll see if it goes further than there. Not sure.
Okay.
We'll see what the Lord does with it. But yes, so you can stay tuned for a book number 2 at some point in the next 18 months to come out.
All right. That's exciting. Well, everyone, I have not done this before, but from our family to your family, we want to give one away. So when this episode drops, it drops on a Thursday, and the Monday following that. So we're going to give through the weekend. Anyone who watches this episode gets to this point where they hear me say this and they just write a comment, just saying something that, you're taking away from this, something that maybe resonated with you, something that has you thinking. If you drop a comment, even if it's just thank you, Elizabeth, for all that you're doing, I will totally count that. We're going to pick someone and we will reach out to. We would love to be able to give one of these away. Again, we appreciate it so much in our household. My husband and I, not growing up in situations where we were taught these things, it's helping to equip us to teach our son things that we hadn't been taught at his age. So we don't know exactly how to do it. And we want to offer that to you guys. So we thought it would be fun. Blaze thought it would be fun to do. So we're going to bring him in on it. We'll let him pick the name. So there you have it. Please leave your comment and we will choose someone. And Elizabeth, again, thank you so much for being here and thank you for all that you're doing.
Thanks so much for having me on again, Naomi. It's been a joy to be with you.